All right, so in this video, we will be looking at past changes in the carbon cycle and how those have influenced climate. So I wanted to start with an image of the Dolomites. This is sort of a famous mountain range up in Italy. You can say they're kind of charismatic, they're really jagged. These are calcium carbonates that were laid down on shallow coral reef-like platforms in the Miocene era, maybe 20 million years ago or so. Now they're up at high elevation. You can see all the snow that they catch here at their base. These carbonates are weathering and returning through rivers back into the ocean. So this is a nice demonstration of the carbon cycle sort of acting on long time scales. And so in this video, what we'll be doing is we'll be tracing the history of atmospheric CO2 over the past 500 million years or so. And we'll connect changes in CO2 to transformations in the carbon cycle and how different mechanisms of change in the carbon cycle control CO2 on different timescales. We'll then connect this back to temperatures globally from paleoclimate archives that run over the past 65 million years ago. We'll extend this a bit to cover the last 500 million years as well. So in the last video, we talked about how changes to Earth's orbit can be the triggers for global climate change, but that the intensity of these changes really depends on things like greenhouse gases, the distribution and size of ice sheets, and how heat is moved throughout the globe through atmospheric circulation and ocean circulation. And to that last point, you can think about the role of plate tectonics in changing the way that the ocean can circulate. So for instance, the connection between North and South America, the Isthmus of Panama, that's only really been intact for the last few million years. Before that, you have waters from the Atlantic and the Pacific freely exchanging through the Caribbean. And then over really long time scales, evolution starts to play a really big role. This is when new abilities show up, plants colonizing land, phytoplankton evolving shells that help them sink into the deep ocean faster, or humans learning that they can burn fossil fuels for energy. So we'll cover some examples of these changes in the next few slides. All right, so here's a reconstruction of atmospheric CO2 over the last 500 million years or so. So this is cut up into a bunch of different time slices covering different magnitudes of changes in time. So first, let's start all the way to the right. This is our present and our future. So you can see here that atmospheric CO2 has been stable at around 280 ppm CO2 for basically the last millennia without much change. And then there's this hockey stick due to the Industrial Revolution and the release of CO2 mostly from coal at the start, and then oil. And then what's shown here are 5 different scenarios for how things could play out in the future. This more aggressive mitigation, RCP3, is has atmospheric CO2 falling back to around 300 ppm as the ocean continues to absorb more and more CO2. But these more probable scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 6, these all sort of equilibrate with around 600 ppm CO2 or so. There's sort of more dire predictions about RCP 8.5 is an extreme business as usual scenario. This could lead to CO2 anywhere in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 ppm. And then you have these more aggressive, basically, thought experiments. What if all of the known fossil fuel reservoirs were burned and released into the atmosphere? And if all of the fossil fuel reservoirs on Earth were burned up, then this would lead to around 5,000 ppm CO2, which would basically exceed anything observed in the last 500 million years. So it's unlikely, but it's a good sort of way to know sort of where the limit is. So this next time slice covers the last 1 million years or so, the last 1,000 years. So this is the Pleistocene era that has the glacial cycles that we've been talking about. It's on a log scale here, so the timing is a bit different than what we were looking at last time, but you can see this transition going back in time from 280 ppm down until the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, where CO2 was around 180 ppm. And then it goes back high during interglacial, low, interglacial, high, low, etc. But one thing to know is that the glacial states have pretty reproducible CO2 concentrations, and the interglacials have pretty reproducible interglacial CO2 concentrations. So it seems like you're just going back and forth between these two states that are relatively consistent. Okay, so this is basically the extent of the really high confidence reconstructions of atmospheric CO2. These are the ice core records where there's air bubbles that we can measure CO2 directly. And going back in time further requires more creative proxies to be used. A lot of these are based on carbon isotopes, so fossilized organic molecules, or by looking at fossilized plants under microscopes and trying to reconstruct how they're taking in gases for carbon fixation, which can be related to CO2. So there's lots of ways to do this. The methods don't always agree, but when you average a whole bunch, you tend to see the trends emerge. And so for the Cenozoic era, this period from 65 million years ago, where the dinosaurs went extinct to basically the start of these glacial cycles, you can see that there's this uptick in CO2 right at the start until 50 million years ago, and then this general decline in atmospheric CO2. And then going further back in time, you can see that these uncertainties increase further. But if you follow these average lines and these confidence intervals that are placed here, you can still see some consistent trends where the CO2 levels were pretty high for a lot of this Mesozoic era. This is when dinosaurs, ruled the land. But before that, the CO2 concentrations were lower, and before that, they were higher. So you can still see these large-scale changes in atmospheric CO2 over this really long time scale. All right, so as we switch time scales from thousands of years to hundreds of millions of years, just remember that Earth's carbon cycle has components that exchange on very, very different time scales. Remember, there's a short-term carbon cycle, this exchange of carbon between the atmosphere, between plants, soils, the ocean. These turn over on timescales of decades to maybe 1,000 years at the most. So, and this is really dominated by the deep ocean here with its 37,000 gigatons of carbon. But over longer timescales, you think, a million years or longer, it's really the size of this pink box changes based on inputs and outputs from the geologic carbon cycle, this long-term carbon cycle. So the ocean can export carbon into marine sediments, which can be converted into sedimentary rocks and stored for really long timescales. And then new carbon can be introduced into the short-term carbon cycle from the mantle through things like volcanoes. So let's return to our reconstruction of atmospheric CO2 and focus on the last 1 million years that cover the glacial cycles. So this is the time window where we'd want to think about the short-term carbon cycle. And so focusing here on this drop in atmospheric CO2 during glacial periods, this has to be related to the removal of carbon out of the atmosphere and likely into the oceans. So how might the ocean store more carbon during glacial periods? Well, this is explained in what's called the Southern Ocean Hypothesis. So there's two components about this hypothesis. One is the increased biological pump efficiency. So remember, the biological pump is taking carbon from the surface ocean and turning it into organisms which sink, and then those are eaten by bacteria in the deep ocean and turned back into CO2. So this is a way of taking carbon from the surface ocean that's in contact with the atmosphere and isolating it in the deep ocean for longer time scales. So the second component of the Southern Ocean Hypothesis is decreased deep ocean ventilation. So it's basically slowing down how rapidly waters from the deep ocean are brought back to the surface where they can exchange carbon with the atmosphere. So take a look at this diagram up here. This is a schematic of today's ocean. Here's Antarctica around here at the south, and then here's the North Pacific here. So what you can see are these two exchange loops. This is the Antarctic bottom water and circumpolar deep water. Those aren't super important. But the idea is that all of this deep ocean water mass is basically coming back to the surface in the Southern Ocean. So, and then as it comes up, it releases CO2. That's what this arrow shows. And because the winds are sort of coming into the screen and then forcing water to the right, this sort of transfers water out of this deep cell and over into the shallow ocean circulation cell. So that's what today's ocean circulation looks like. Here's what it's expected to look like in the last glacial maximum. So basically, you have more sea ice extent because you have bigger glaciers and temperatures cool down. And so this basically is a cap on this deep ocean ventilation. So as a result, this CO2 coming back out of the ocean is a lot less intense. So you basically trapped all this carbon in the deep ocean, and it's kind of capped. Second, because things get colder, the sort of wind belts shift. And so if this wind belt shifts a bit further north, then you're upwelling waters out of this sort of shallow cell and not this deep cell anymore. And then the component related to the biological pump relates to iron, which we discussed in the previous video. Basically today, the biological pump is pretty weak in the Southern Ocean because there's not enough iron to power photosynthesis. So the transport of carbon down into the deep ocean is relatively small. But in the past, one of the consequences to global cooling is that there's less water evaporated from the ocean. And as a result, inland areas don't get as much rain, they dry out, and their soils turn to dust. That dust gets transported out to the ocean and relieves this iron limitation and increases this export flux, this biological pump, returning carbon to the deep ocean. So these are the two components of the Southern Ocean Glacial hypothesis. There's more carbon being transported down to the deep ocean, and the deep ocean can't ventilate as easily, so you end up storing more carbon here. So going back to our CO2 map, we can understand the changes in atmospheric CO2 during glacial periods. There's a change in ocean circulation and ocean biology that allows the oceans to become a bigger carbon reservoir during glacial periods that removes CO2 from the atmosphere, causing the atmospheric CO2 pressure to drop. This, because you have less CO2 in the atmosphere, then you're retaining less heat from the sun, and this allows ice sheets to build up, which then reflect more heat back out through albedo, and then that sort of creates this runaway cooling that starts here and then ends up in these full ice ages. So now let's go further back in time. Now we're thinking about timescales of millions of years or so in the second panel. This is long enough where we have to consider the long-term carbon cycle, to consider new inputs of carbon from volcanoes and then changes in the output of carbon from weathering that leads to the burial of carbon in marine sediments as things like calcium carbonate. So you can see here from the past 50 million years, there's been this steady decrease in carbon that's basically progressed until the glacial periods began. This coincides with this really unique tectonic event, the collision of the Indian plate with the Himalayas. You can see here India is colliding into South Asia. You can see the Tibetan plateau first forms and then it keeps getting bigger and bigger. All this land turns into high altitude masses. Let's watch it one more time because it's cool. So you can see here all these island arcs come up, those get smushed together, turned into mountains in this high altitude land. All right, and so why does this matter? Well, if you remember from the carbon cycle video, we talked about this weathering reaction, and this is the reaction of certain components of rocks, such as calcium oxides, reacting with carbon dioxide. And then this forms bicarbonate that washes into the ocean, but ultimately in the ocean, this forms minerals like calcium carbonate that remove carbon from this carbon cycle. So here you've taken carbon from the atmosphere and locked it away in the seafloor, where it can turn into things like sedimentary rocks. So uplift of new mountain ranges can lead to enhanced weathering rates and enhanced uptake of CO2 that are buried in marine sediments. And that's the hypothesis for why the Himalayan collision caused this long-term decline in CO2 over the Cenozoic era over the last 50 million years. So the effect of this tectonic activity that's occurring here is basically taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, storing it in the ocean, but ultimately turning it into a sink from the carbon cycle as calcium carbonate and sediments. And this is the major hypothesis for why CO2 has declined over the Cenozoic era over the last 50 million years. Okay, and let's look further back in time to timescales of hundreds of millions of years, this first panel here. You can notice that if you started here, you observe this huge plummet of CO2 from 2,000 ppm down to something that's almost like 300, basically what things were in the pre-industrial era. This huge plummet is associated actually with the evolution of woody plants. This happened in a period that we now call the Carboniferous. So the word carbon in this name kind of is a giveaway of what's going on here. This is a time when almost all the world's coal beds were formed. This is where a lot of the coal that was later burned in the Industrial Revolution was first formed, basically 300 million years ago. But before that was the Devonian period. So during this time, if you were around to see a landscape, you would see few woody trees and very little land carbon storage. So you would expect kind of dry soils here that didn't have a whole lot of carbon in them. There's high CO2, so there's high temperatures. Greenhouse is in full effect. But what makes the Devonian period before, from 420 to 360 million years, different from the Carboniferous period is this evolution of woody plants. So if you think about wood, right, it's great for building things. It's really sturdy, so you can build tall trees. But it's also really hard to break down, right? And so when this first evolved, this is a huge biological innovation. Now these trees could grow, and then all the bugs and insects that were eating them before, they couldn't do nothing. Those trees could last forever. And then when the trees died, those logs just sat there. No one was eating them. They just sort of became part of the soil. And then even when they were in the soil, no one was eating them either. They became coal. So this persisted until fungi and mushrooms just at some point learned how to digest these. There's a special enzyme that had to be evolved to sort of break apart these really strong chemical bonds that are in wood. But before then, there was this sort of massive CO2 storage because you had all this terrestrial biomass that was being preserved on long timescales in a way that it really isn't today. This led to this massive uptake of CO2. Because CO2 dropped, temperatures dropped as well. So here's just an example of how some biological innovations through evolution have a really big impact on the global carbon cycle in Earth's past. And actually, at this point, CO2 levels dropped so much, there was so much global cooling that ice sheets started to develop in the South Pole during this time period. So this is a really massive global change. So now that we have this sense of the different types of factors that can control Earth's CO2, let's go revisit temperature. So here's a slightly different temperature reconstruction. It's based off very similar data, but this now extends over the past 500 million years or so. You can see that over the last 1 million years, when Earth had low CO2 during glacial periods and more moderate during interglacial periods, this coincides with this oscillation between low temperatures during glacial maxima and then high temperatures during interglacials, low, high. So we talked about this in the previous video. There's a really great correlation between temperature and CO2 over the glacial cycles. And then, looking into the Cenozoic, we talked about how the collision between India and Asia resulted in the uplift of the Himalayas, which led to all this weathering. And you can see temperatures drop from this maximum in the Eocene. That's maybe 10 or more degrees hotter than today. Consistent throughout this Cenozoic era up until the last million years, until the glacial cycles start to take over. And so this is sort of an amazing testament to the fact that you take carbon out of the atmosphere through weathering, the planet cools. And similarly, let's go look at the Carboniferous. So this D right here is Devonian. This C is the Carboniferous. You can see how this really warm environment from the Devonian chills out real fast once you take out carbon and storing it on land as wood that turns into coal. So this just shows you, I think, really well how astounding the links between atmospheric CO2 and climate have been throughout really long periods of Earth history. So in this next video, we'll focus on this kind of rebound from this Permian Carboniferous period, jumping back up to warm temperatures. This is a major mass extinction that bears some analogy to today. So to recap, we explored the links between atmospheric CO2 and changes in the carbon cycle over the past 500 million years. On short timescales, these are due to differences in the partitioning of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean. But on longer timescales, the dominant players are really the inputs and outputs of carbon through volcanic activity and weathering. And on longer timescales, there's a really key role for biological evolution in basically sort of wiring the carbon cycle, and allowing carbon sequestration where there wasn't before.